One of Merrilee's biggest fears was a disease called typhus, spread by lice. So, under the pretense of sanitary betterment work, he helped lead a campaign to inspect every house in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. If the inspectors found lice, occupants were forced to take vinegar and kerosene baths, have their heads shaved, and clothing burned. Hundreds of homes were eventually destroyed. Lee also expanded the supposed health measures to include inmates in the El Paso jail.
They had to strip naked, take a bath inside a tub full of kerosene, and on one occasion, it seems somebody lit a match.
27 prisoners, majority Mexican or Mexican American, burned to death in the fire that the newspapers called the Jail Holocaust. But despite the tragic fire, Merrilee pushed forward with even more aggressive plans.
He sends a telegram, a Western Union telegram, to Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General up in Washington, D.C. And basically, well, let me just read it. Hundreds dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
The government didn't agree to a full quarantine because evidence suggested that typhus wasn't a major threat in the area. But instead, they funded a new disinfection plant at the border in 1916. In this facility, every immigrant considered a second-class citizen had to strip naked. Their clothes were sent to a large steam dryer and then fumigated with toxic pesticides inside the gas room. An inspector would check each person's body, including private parts, for lice. If they found lice, immigrants would have to shave their head and body hair and bathe in a mix of kerosene and vinegar. Some even had their eyelids checked for things like pink eye, and many had to complete puzzles or simple IQ tests to prove that they were fit for entry. After this process, they'd receive a ticket as proof that they were disinfected, but they would need to go through this every 8 days in order to re-enter the U.S.
So many people didn't speak about it. They didn't talk about this humiliating process, like they kind of internalized it. It's that psychology of shame.
The discriminatory policies at the border resembled horrific events elsewhere in the world. In fact, while researching this, David stumbled upon a detail. The fumigation of Mexican immigrants wasn't just reminiscent of Nazi Germany, it was directly linked to it.
It's not so much that the United States was copying Nazi Germany, it's the opposite. Nazi Germany was copying the United States.
He found that in the 1920s, the U.S. started using Zyklon B, an extremely poisonous acid gas, to fumigate clothing at the border. And in 1937, in a German pest science journal, a scientist called for the use of Zyklon B in Nazi disinfection chambers. He included 2 photos of El Paso's delousing chambers as an example of how effective Zyklon B had been at the U.S. border to kill unwanted pests. The same scientist pushed to use it to disinfect concentration camps, and eventually it was used in concentrated doses to murder millions of people.
People, rightly so, say you can't compare what happened in Nazi Germany with other parts of the world. And that's true. In terms of Zyklon B, it was used on the border not to intentionally kill Mexican border crossers. But the history of something like the Holocaust doesn't take place in a vacuum.
A few decades after the Bath riots, Mexico started sending men to work on U.S. farms and railroads as part of a new labor agreement called the Bracero Program. And through the program, the border disinfections continued. Here in this facility, some migrants were sprayed with insecticides. This time, it was a substance called DDT,
dichloro-diphenyl-trichloroethane,
a toxic pesticide which decades later would be banned for agricultural use by most developed countries.
Repeated contact must be avoided. They were sprayed in the face. They were sprayed in their private parts. And, they were stripped naked and inspected. And sometimes they're inspected like you would inspect livestock.
First-hand accounts from immigrants in the program reveal how little they knew about the fumigations.
So they talk about how humiliating it was, about why do they think we're so dirty? They all call it the white powder. I don't know if they necessarily were told we're spraying you with DDT, but they'll call it polvo, the powder.
A miraculous white powder that is helping to win the war against disease.
Many of the employees who worked in the facilities weren't given many details either.
When I first started, my role was a clerk. I got the job mainly because I spoke Spanish. There was a hut in the area when they came in from the Mexican side that they were going there, and they had some sort of, it was for lice, they said. It was, to disinfect for lice. And we never gave it much thought, but we did think, that's sort of like what the Nazis used to do, to the Jews.
I had heard during lunch breaks that they would spray them, and sometimes there were comments from the men themselves that they would put a hose to them. I don't know if they knew what they were doing to them. I certainly didn't know, it was far-fetched from the world we lived in.
It wasn't until the 1960s, when the Bracero program ended, that health authorities acknowledged the chemicals were dangerous and the baths and fumigations were finally discontinued.
You want history to be about progress, about everybody realizes how horrible it is, and then it stops. Unfortunately, that's how it works in movies, but this was the border, right? And in the border, a lot of things never become resolved. They just keep on repeating themselves.